Yeah, nice. We're getting there. At some point, we'll explode in joy as the 3, 2, 1 counter goes off. Okay, so this morning we left off, and we had. Oh, thanks for doing that. I think you have to press the bottom. Cool. All of them.
Thank you.
This morning when we left off, we had a working version of this little single-page app that was using Redux. We had written our first reducer. We were dispatching these actions, increment and decrement, and it was good. We're using this. We can move our little pieces of our application around without having to refactor everywhere where we kept the state. So if we wanted to move this description from the header into the counter again, back to where it was when we sort of started this whole mess, we could just go ahead and just move these lines, the render description lines, and there we go. And we don't break the application when we move just something that's UI, because the UI carries around the dependencies that it has on the state. So we don't need to reconfigure where our state lives when we move some piece of UI around, because it's right there. It doesn't have some extra dependency. It doesn't change something somewhere else. Let's rewind that a little bit. Put the count back in the header, and there we go. So we can move this around without changing the way that we handle state. So that's pretty cool. We also had a bunch of problems that we still had sort of lingering around. In particular, we had this really nasty subscription business. It's like both doing something that we don't really understand and re-rendering our entire app every time anything changes. So that's not great. We'd like to get rid of this. We also had some other problems, some of which we fixed. We fixed the if-else-if business with a switch statement, so that was good. We figured out, after doing that exercise, how to parameterize our actions to make them a little bit more general. So instead of only being able to increment by 1 or increment by 3, instead increments take an amount. And so you can actually increment by whatever. You can send any amount to this. And so adding another button that increments by some other amount is pretty easy. Let's go ahead and see that. We'll go, here's a new button. How much do we want this button to increment by? We'll figure out. 10,000? Oh my gosh, 10,000. It's higher than 9,000. All right. It's over 9,000. Wow, you're right. Okay. Store.dispatch. Type increment amount 10,000. We're just doing an inline arrow function here instead of naming this function and passing it out. Which do you guys like to read better? You're allowed to have an opinion on this.
Depends on the situation.
Depends on the situation. What are the benefits and drawbacks here?
You don't have to go hunting for what that does.
You don't have to go hunting for what it does if it's in line. If it's in line, you see exactly what's going to happen. It's pretty obvious. But what if you're using it in lots of places and it gets a little clunky, it gets a little cluttered? If we had all of our buttons like this render would start to get pretty hairy. Trying to read everything here would get to be kind of a mess. This is a trade-off. The trade-off between writing this as an anonymous function versus writing it as named functions and extracting them. You get to make that decision on your own. My intuition tells me that this render is starting to get kind of long, so it's possible that we would want to pull this into a this dot increment by 10,000. But for now, we'll just leave it like this. Should be okay. See that we've got the plus 10,000 button. Looks like it works just fine. The cool thing was that we didn't actually have to make any changes to the reducer because we already had all of the power that we needed from this amount. So we could customize the action to do something that felt intuitive. So this is pretty cool. We figured out this this parameterization of our actions. We can make them a little bit more powerful by adding more data to the action object. Okay. We still have to figure out how to deal with many keys and many actions. We saw that it was easy to make typos in action strings. We'll see a fix for this if we get there. This is sort of there is a good pattern for it, but it's not quite as tricky as the main subject of today's lecture, which is mostly handling this subscription, handling this connection between React and Redux. Right now, it's gross that we even have to think about subscriptions at all. It re-renders all the components on any store change. The other piece that we started to talk about just a little bit, we briefly touched on this, was that it's not expressive. From reading this, the like gross subscription business, you can't tell what data each component depends on. It would be nice if, as a side benefit to this connection logic that we were writing, we also could read off the dependencies that each component had on our data. So we can say, oh, this header, it needs to know about the count. When the count changes, I'll expect that the header will change. This counter, it needs to know about the count and how to increment and decrement. That's its set of dependencies on the data in our Redux store. That kind of expression and being able to see what your components are using, really, really powerful, important for particularly when our projects grow to be pretty large. It helps things be much more clear. So we'll also get that as a benefit when we switch over to the new version of connecting our components. We want these to be modular. We want not to write everything in one page. And we know that when we move things to other pages, we'll need some way of connecting to the store, because we won't just have the store in some constant. So we'll have to figure that out as we're going. Is there anything from this morning's lecture that we wanted to touch on again that was confusing? We are moving pretty quickly through a lot of this Redux stuff. So if you wanted to see more about actions or more about the reducer, more about get state or dispatch, we could stop here. We could pause and dive in a little bit more. What's up, Melissa?
Sorry, when we define our variables, increment action, and after the type increment.
Yeah. These constants?
Gotcha. Yep. Okay. No, I was just looking.
You just wanted to see this code.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is not a like real pattern. I just had this as a consequence of the way that we were developing this morning. We could move all of this somewhere else, or we could inline all of these actions or some other thing. We just happened to declare them as constants. That's not like that's not always how you'll see them. Any other thoughts, observations, questions, interests? Everybody wants to see React Redux. Y'all want to see provider and connect. Oh yeah, we're going to see provider and connect. That's what we're going to do today. Okay, cool. So we know that we've got this big problem. We're pretty motivated to find a solution. If we went and poked around the Redux documentation, who has read the Redux documentation? Yes, I saw Hillary's hand went straight up. She's read all of it. The docs are great. They're great. They're great. Has anybody read any sentences in the Redux docs that they've been like, I don't really get that one? If you do, Slack them to me, because I think we can probably PR against the documentation and say like, hey, I've got this issue. I read this sentence and I was confused. This is a good time for us to like contribute back to the community. So if you find yourself confused by anything, it's probably because it's confusing and we should make it better. Okay. If we poked around that documentation, we would find that there's a separate library, a second library that we use when we're using React and Redux together, called React Redux, that does a lot of this connection for us. It provides a couple of utilities that we're going to use pretty constantly in order to connect React and Redux. In order to use this library, we need to install it. So I'm going to yarn add React Redux. While it's installing, you can use Redux in other projects, basically the way that we've done, just by using it. There's also, depending on what other front-end framework you're using, like Vue or Angular, you could connect those libraries to Redux using the particular connector library that those support. So for Vue, it's probably something like Vue Redux or Redux Vue. For Angular, it's probably Redux Angular or Angular Redux. Makes sense. Oh, wow, getting a lot of warnings here. I'm going to ignore it. Looks like it's going to be fine. Yeah, it looks like it's just some warnings about some deprecated stuff. Okay. I think that we should now be able to import stuff from React Redux. So far, the only import that we've used from Redux is create store. There are other exports that Redux has. We're going to dive into them later. Let's take a look at the React Redux documentations just to see what it provides. Okay, React Redux. And we got some documentation here. React Redux gets started. Save React Redux. Ah, okay. It looks like here's the import line from React Redux. We've got this thing called provider. Provides provider, which makes the Redux store available to the rest of your app. Interesting. Interesting. We'll have to dig into this a little bit more. Connect. React Redux provides connect function for you to connect your components to the store. Normally, you'll call connect in this way. Whoa, this is a little bit confusing. Okay, so we'll need to investigate those two things. That's it. Those are the two things that React Redux has, provider and connect. When you are using React Router, let's do a brief React Router review. I'm going to actually go ahead and add the import line first. Import provider and connect from React Redux. We're going to dive into what those things mean, what the documentation meant, that it provides provider, which makes Redux store available to the rest of your app, and we're gonna dive into this connect function. Connect, this is the hardest function in Redux. It's got a pretty wacky signature. It's a lot of like thinking in functions. We're gonna pick it apart and then put it back together, and then we'll feel pretty comfortable with it. Hopefully by the end of this lecture, but maybe it'll take a couple days of practice. Okay, before we can dive into that, we need to review something a little bit off the subject of state management. We need to review React Router. I'm gonna do some pop quiz questions. How do we set up React Router at the base of our app so that we had access to all of the React Router components in the inside of our app? This is a question for the whiteboards. Everybody go ahead. Try and write out like the explanation, maybe a snippet of code to see how you would set this up. Once you've written out the answer, you can go ahead and just like flip that whiteboard to me, and I'll take a look. Feel free to grab a whiteboard if you haven't got one. That's a piece of it, I think, between you and.
I didn't get it wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, between you and mine, you got me the whole thing.
Nice.
There you go. Here you go.
Nice.
Final answers.
That's one.
Full road burger.
You're the you take
I think you got
Same thing, right? You use
Fluids.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
You just
Okay. Take a look at your neighbor's answer if they feel confident about it and you want to check it out. I'm gonna wait for Amy to come back with the whiteboard.
I mean, you just import the whole thing, like you can move router, and then you use it in just the app.
Right. There's a wrapper that you use, a wrapper component to use around the rest of your app.
I'm not sure what the term for that is.
You can just write the snippet of code. It might be easier. Can I see some back row boards? Nice, nice, cool.
I could never press the buttons properly. Would never.
Okay, let's come back together. So the answers that I've been seeing that were in various stages of sort of completeness, it was something like you import the like the router somehow from React Router DOM. I think you do like browser router as router. Different versions of React Router have had this export named differently, so I'm doing this in a way that may or may not be what the latest has. From React Router DOM, and then around your app component. So before you were exporting something like a component that had app in render. Now instead of just having that, you also need to wrap that in this browser router component, like this, and browser router. What did this do for us? Doing this plumbing in our index. Iman?
It let us use like link and redirect with router components anywhere in our app.
It let us use link and route and redirect components in the rest of our application. It did something. It set something up. Now we haven't dove into exactly what it changed to make it so that those things would work, but it did something. This kind of plumbing or boilerplate, it's stuff that you need in order to make something else work. We're going to investigate this a little bit more in a little bit more depth with provider. And provider, it's got the same idea. It's going to set up something so that the rest of the application has access to stuff that it needs. Okay, second pop quiz question about React Router. This one's a little bit trickier because you might not have seen it in the course of the labs. Maybe you saw it, and maybe you used it in your projects, but this one you can feel free to pair up. What did the with router function do? What did the with router function do? Feel free to either Google it or ask your neighbor.
I think the way I understood it is to say, props, image history, props, push to history, you could like redirect. That was the URL you redirected to. That's all I used it for. And the other stuff, like if
Okay, we got sidetracked. All right. Let's come back together in 5, 4, 2, 1. What does with router do? This table here was proud of their explanation. Okay, we wrote out a snippet of how we use it. We could import with router from React Router DOM, and then what did we pass in a component? That's at least the syntax that we're doing. We import from React Router DOM, and then what was the line? We export like whatever our component was. We had like export some component, And then we, instead of exporting some component, we would export with router some component. What does this do? That's the real question. What's that?
Gives you access to like props that come with that. I know one of them is like a secret thing that you can kind of get pushed into a set URL.
That's a great description. It gives you access to some props. Inside of the body of this sum component, now, without using sum component as the child of a route component, we still get the props that we would get if we had put it as the child of a route component. If you guys remember, like children of the route component, or if you like use the render prop to the route component, you would do something like route, and then you've got like a children equals some component, and then some component would get in some props. Some component would get props. And I think it's history and something else. Location, match. Thanks. Sometimes you want to get this history, location, and match props without having this some component be the child of a route. So we can use this function with router. We pass in some component, and then this with router function gives back a function. Sorry, it gives back a component. We pass in a component, we get back a component, and that new component, that wrapped version, is always going to get these props. Gives you access to the props, including the history, inside of some component. Let's take a look at the function signature of this with router function. What does it take in as its argument? A component. It takes in a React component. And what does it return? Melissa's got it. It's another React component. This is kind of funky. It takes in a React component, and it gives us back some more advanced React component, some specialized React component that also has this additional behavior. This pattern, where you've got a function that decorates another component, it's called a higher order function. And when we're talking about React in particular, this is called a higher order component. A higher order component. You'll see people use this abbreviation HOC for React higher order components because they don't like typing out this whole thing. Higher order means that it's not just a component, it's components that make components, or functions that take in components, operate on them, and give you back other ones. Meta components. The next step after with router, you might be wondering, well, what if we didn't just want to pass in history, location, and match? What if we wanted to pass in some other props? What if we wanted to customize which other props we passed in based on some function? Maybe we would want some function, some special HOC function that had a signature from some like customization stuff, and it returned a higher order component function. Well, this is a wacky function signature. This special HOC function that we're mentioning here, it takes in some customization. We haven't specified exactly what that customization looks like. It returns a function. That function looks a lot like our with router function. That function takes in a React component, returns a more advanced React component that maybe gets in some props. It's a little abstract. Let's just get a thumbs up, thumbs down scale on like how you're feeling about this like function signature. Okay. All right. It's pretty wacky. It's pretty wacky. We're gonna make it more concrete in just a minute. In particular, this thing here, this is the function signature of connect. It takes in some kind of customization, and it gives us back a function that's like with router. Connect is going to take in some kind of customization, and it's going to give us back something that's like with router. That things like with router, they take in some component, they give back another component, and that component is going to always get in some props. Okay, let's actually see this. The tricky thing is that we've got to do this customization thing so that we know which props are going to get passed in, and that part's a little bit confusing on its own. So we're going to move through that really quickly, and then we're going to come back and dig in more deeply. So I'm gonna just go ahead and write out this thing. Let's connect our header to the store. Okay, yeah. So we're going to use the connect function from React Router. We're going to pass in some kind of customization. This is going to give us back some like with header props function. Just like it's going to be like with router, but it's just going to give us the header props, whatever props we want to pass in to the header. Then we're going to, instead of just having like the normal header, we want to get back a connected version of the header. So we're going to say const connected header equals with header props with our header passed in. Now, instead of using our normal header in app, we want to use the connected version. We want to use the connected header. So we'll go ahead and switch this to connected header here. That way, we're going to use the connected version of the header instead of the normal version of the header. Okay, connected header. So far, we haven't told Connect how it's going to actually connect the store to this header. We haven't customized this. We haven't actually generated a real with header props function. Let's think about what props we'd like to pass into the header from the store. So what props does the header need from the Redux store? What from the Redux store does our header depend on? Take a second to write down your thought. You can go ahead and flash me the whiteboard if you've written it down. Interesting. Okay. So the data that the header depends on, I like it much better when you take a guess and the guess is not like quite the right thing than if you don't write down anything, because it gives me a sense for the fact that you're thinking and the chance to know like where we are as a group, because maybe we need to move back, maybe we need to slow down. But if you don't write down anything, I don't know whether you're like way ahead of me and bored or like way behind, and so that's hard. If you just write down I don't know, much better than writing down nothing. Okay. So to rewind back in time a second, the goal of switching to using React Redux is to make it so that we don't have to do this subscription here, and so that we don't have to use store.getState in all of our components. This part isn't totally obvious because it seems like store.getState's pretty good. The problem with using store.getState is that if we use it with abandon, then we have no way of knowing which components need to update when we use different pieces of the state. If you use store.getState, there's no way to tell the header that you need to re-render when the count has changed, but not re-render if some other piece of the state has changed. So we need to specify, hey, here's what the header depends on. That way, we can get rid of this subscription business, and then the header will still get the part of the store that it needs. And it'll still update when the count changes. Okay. Right now, our store is shaped like this. It's got a count, which is a number. And it turns out that the only thing that the header needs from this big, giant, complex store is the count. So we need to get this count into the header somehow through this connect function. So what we'd like to do is to make our with header props function. We'd like it to pass in the props that it should pass in should be count. Does that make sense? Just like with router was going to pass in match and location and history, we want with header props to pass in count. Okay. This is the props that the header needs from the Redux store. Now we get into the heart of this customization business. We need to know how we actually customize this with header props function so that it passes in the right props to our header. We're going to use a function called map state to props. This is just a conventional name for this function, but what it does is it takes in the state of the Redux store, and it spits out the props that you need for some component. Const map state to props equals. It takes in the state from the Redux store, and we need it to return we need to return the props that we need for the header. Now, this actually, it's not that bad. It's like, okay, we need to do this customization. A function, that's a pretty good way to customize something. The thing that we need to do is figure out what piece of the state is going to get passed in as props to the header. Having a function that takes in the state and returns those props, that makes pretty good sense. It's not a bad way to do it. So, how do we get the stuff that we need from the state here and turn it into an object full of props to pass in to the header? We're going to return some kind of object. What's the key that we want to pass into our header? Count. And how do we get the count out of the state of the Redux store? State.count. Okay, that seems like it ought to work. Map state to props. We take in some state, we return an object. This object is the props that we want to pass in to our component. We're going to use that map state to props. That's our customization for this connect. Map state to props. Now our connected header is just the with header props version of the header. That's what we're using in our app. And what's the over-under on whether or not we have any errors when we flip back. It's very likely that we have errors. It seems almost impossible that we'll have actually gotten this right. Okay, we've got an error. Good. Could not find store in the context of connect header. Either wrap the root component in a provider or pass a custom React context provider to provider and the corresponding React context consumer to connect header and connect options. Whoa. Okay. Wrap the root component in a provider. We forgot to do the provider step. This is the error that you'll see if you haven't set up the plumbing. Who's seen the error that you see if you forget to set up the plumbing for browser router? Okay, some people have seen that error because they forgot to set up browser and tried to use a link or tried to use a route. And you need to set up the plumbing in order to use all of these components. In this case, in order to use the connect function, we need to set up the plumbing with provider. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say that, so we've got this provider component imported from React Redux, and we need to put a provider around our entire application. Provider here around the application, and provider. What is this provider supposed to provide? Any guesses? The store. It needs to provide this store. We need to get access to the store in the rest of the application. But how does the provider know what store to provide? We got to tell it. We got to pass a prop. Store equals our store. We give the store to our provider. The provider gives the store to the rest of our app. And now we're no longer broken. At least, hopefully. We'll see. Huh. It looks like the header is still working. Okay, this is going to take a while. Wow, that was fast. All right. We have our fun. Okay, hang on a second. We haven't actually changed anything about the way that this header works. This header is actually still using store.getState.count. So we don't actually know whether it's getting this props correctly. Let's go ahead and just console log this.props in our render for the header, just to see whether or not it's working. We also have another console log that I'll comment out because we want to focus. So let's console log. This is the header props. Okay, so we see that the header props that we're getting right now are the count and the dispatch function. A little bit weird. We didn't customize to pass that in, but we got it as a prop anyway. Interesting. And if we've got the count as this.props.count, then we actually don't need to rely on store.getState.count anymore. Pretty cool. We can say count equal this.props.count. And our header still looks like it's updating properly. Pretty cool. We no longer depend on that global store constant that was just floating around everywhere. Now, it's actually not that bad to try to extract this header component into its own file. Do we want to try it? Yeah, y'all are sick of seeing us have all of these components in just one big file. Yeah, it's pretty gross. I agree. Let's go ahead and make a new file. Header.js. We'll go ahead and pull this header business all out and into header.js. And let's see. Promptly everything will break. Connected header is not defined. Okay, let's import our connected header from header.js. Okay, and And component is not defined. React must be in scope. Okay. I think we need to do some imports in here. What do we need to import? Import React from React. And it said that we are using component, so we also need component. Ooh, okay. Okay. Logo is not defined. Connect is not defined. Whew. Getting there. Let's just copy this whole line. We actually only need the connect function. We don't need provider. Logo is not defined. Let's go ahead and grab this logo line. We want to cut and export defaults imported as connected header was not found in header. Probably need to export something as the defaults. Let's go ahead and export defaults, the connected header, and save everything. Hey, we're rendering again. That's good. Connect is defined but never used because we were only using it in the header. And hey, look at that. Header now in its own component. And it specifies exactly what it needs from the Redux store right here. It says, if you were to give me the state from the Redux store, here's exactly which props I need. I need the count. I need the count out of the Redux store. Here it is. We build this function with header props by using connect. It's really similar to that with router function. We build our own with some props function out of connect and some map state to props function. And then we use that to make a connected version of this component. And that's what we actually need to use in some other place. We've got a couple convention violations that are going on here because we're being really explicit about what each step does. I'm gonna change just one, and that's to say, instead of importing connected header from header, we're just gonna import header from header. And then in our app, we're not even gonna think about what the data is for the header. App has no knowledge anymore of the data needs of the header. It doesn't even know that header is connected to Redux. All of that logic, it's pushed down into this header. Kind of cool. Okay. We've got 15 minutes. Do y'all want to try to, on your own, connect the counter to the Redux store? Do we want to do it together? Hands up for doing it on our own and then coming back. Wow, that was 0 hands. Okay, this stuff is pretty tricky. This is the hard part of Redux. It's dealing with these abstract functions. Hands up for seeing this together. Hands up for a nap. Wow. Okay. Strong competition from nap. Let's actually, before we try to do this for a header, let's actually stand up and just take a stretch. It's pretty abstract. Good to. Yep. Okay. It's gonna be fine. This stuff is wacky. Doing all kinds of function signature stuff. Super weird. But maybe not so bad. Y'all excited to see the science fair tonight?
Yes.
Yeah. Totally forgot.
It's gonna be awesome.
Did you see it? It's amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Before we actually connect our header using React Redux, let's actually draw out this application and see how everything is sort of hooked up. So we've got 3 components here. we've got app and header and counter. And we've got our Redux store over here. So app is rendering header and counter, and it's also wrapping them in this provider so that they have access to the store throughout the app. So we've got the provider here. So now header is connected directly to the store. It says the store, it's going to give me the count. How do we know? How do we know? We set it up. How did we set it up? What was the setup that we did? We write this function map state to props. That's what's picking out the count from the store and saying this is what the header needs. What about the counter? It's sort of connected to the store, but it's connected to the store in a kind of a gross way. It's connected to the store by using the store global variable, or I guess it's like a file level constant, something like that. Not quite global, but it's just like using the store directly. And so we don't actually know what the counter needs from the store. It could be anything. If the store changes, our counter's not going to update, except that right now our app is doing this subscription. Let's actually take that subscription out and see what happens to our app. Huh. Interesting. What's going on here? Take a second to ponder. Andrew's got a thought. Andrew, what is it?
I believe that the count is being updated, but without the subscription, it is not rendering those changes to the DOM.
To the whole DOM?
Just no, that portion.
Just the counter. Just the counter. Because this is a dotted line instead of a solid line, the app doesn't actually know. Nothing's telling the counter that it needs to update. It's not getting the new props. The connect function is giving us the props, and it's making sure that those props actually go in when they change. So header's props change, and so the header changes. It re-renders. We see it. The state is actually updating when we click this, but the count in the counter isn't updating because it's got a direct dependency on the store. Here, like store.getState.count. And so nothing's telling the counter, hey, you need to update because the count has changed. So it doesn't update. Okay. That's starting to make some sense. I can see some nods. Don't worry too much about it. The syntax of connect is going to be the major sticking point, and that's the one that we want to focus all our energy on. But this is sort of what's going on, why we want to use connect. Because then we can tell the counter, hey, you depend on the count from the store, so when the count changes, you need to update. Okay. You might be wondering, we've also got this store mentioned a couple other places where we're dispatching actions. We probably need to figure out how to connect to the dispatch function in the store too. We'll see that too. We might get to that tomorrow. Okay, let's try to connect the counter to our store. Let's sort of write this starting with the map state to props function. We'll start with what dependencies our counter has on the store, and then we'll actually write the connect syntax. Cool? Okay. Map state to props. It's going to be a function. What does the map state to props function take in? Takes in the state. And what's it going to return? It's going to return some props. It's going to return some object full of props. Some props object. Props object. In this case, what do we want? What data does this counter depend on from the store? The count. This one is pretty easy because the state only has one thing, but that's always a question that we want to ask ourselves whenever we're connecting some component to the store. What data does this component depend on? Okay, we depend on props count. And this map state to props function is actually going to look pretty familiar. We want to pass in a count. How do we get at the count? State.count. Okay. And this is our function. Pretty simple. It's going to take in the state of the Redux store. It's going to return this object full of props. Let's go ahead and use this map state to props function to connect our counter to the store. Let's go ahead and create this intermediate function, const with counter props. How did we get this intermediate function? Connect. Connect, it's like a higher order component. It's like second level. It generates this with counter props function. So we connect, and we need to pass in some kind of customization. What's our customization? Map state to props. Map state to props. And then we want to generate the actual connected counter. Const connected counter. And this is, how do we actually get the connected version of the counter? We actually use the function. Okay, with counter props on the counter. And then we want to use this version rather than the other version, so let's go ahead and change it up. Connected counter. And boom! Looks like it's working okay. Cool. Let's try to extract this into its own file. We're going to run into some kind of issue. What's the issue that we're going to run into? Importing, exporting. What in particular is going to not work that we didn't run into when we were doing the header? Dispatch. This dispatch business, we're going to have to figure this one out. We get the same imports, I think, that we need to bring the header. And what do we export? We're going to export default the connected version of the counter. So our index, it's not even going to know about the connected counter anymore. It's just going to import a counter. Counter from counter. And we'll change this name back. Oh gosh. Failed to compile. Store is not defined. Increment actions not defined. Increment by 3 actions not defined. Store is not defined. Oh my gosh. Okay, it's pretty bad. These ones we can actually just move over. The app doesn't need to know anything about them. It's really the counter that needs to know about them. I don't know if I love these being constants, but it's fine for now. Store is not defined in source counter.js. Anybody have any ideas for how we can deal with this? Take a second, write down an idea on the whiteboard. If your idea is move it back to the index.js file, go ahead and write that down. Okay, I'm seeing a lot about dispatch. So there's one idea that I think is actually pretty interesting, which is we could like send this store over somehow. We're creating this store here in app. App has actually also gotten to be pretty small. It used to be like a couple hundred lines. Now it's only 70, and a lot of that's just comments from like the notes we were taking this morning. So getting pretty tidy. Right now we're not exporting anything from here. Maybe we could export the store and import it and just call dispatch on the store. That's one idea. We're not going to do it that way. It's for no reason that I've really been able to figure out. It's not the recommended pattern that people use. So we're gonna follow the pattern that I've seen people use a lot more. If you remembered from when we were logging those header props, we actually have an additional prop that we weren't using. Let's just go ahead and comment out all of the places where we're mentioning store here. Oh, we forgot that we need to we'll just take this one out for now. Okay. If we look at this header props, we actually get the dispatch function. So we can just call this.props.dispatch instead of calling store.dispatch. Let's actually do that first, and then we'll talk about the solution that we're going to see more often. So instead of store.dispatch, let's try this. This is if you hit Command and D, you get to multi-edit. It's kind of a cool feature. This.props.dispatch, all of these things, and this had an onClick function, and it was doing this.props.dispatch, a action with type increments and amount 10,000. Okay. Cool. So we can just use the dispatch prop. That's kind of neat. This'll in general work okay. We're going to see that there's another pattern that we're going to start to use. Basically, similar to the way that we map state to props, we can also map the dispatch function to some props for our component. So instead of depending on the dispatch function directly, which is like a little bit awkward, we can call functions like a prop, this.props.onClick, or this.props.increment. And it's a little bit more semantic, and there's another couple of side benefits that we'll see as we move into some of the other helpers that Redux and React Redux give us. There's something called action creators, which gives us a nice syntactic sugar around all of this, which is kind of cool. Okay. This was pretty heavy as far as lectures go. The key is that we've got this provider, which sets up some boilerplate. We've got this connect function, which works a lot like the with router from React Router, but we get to customize it with a map state to props function. If you take away those two pieces, you're golden. There's going to be lots of practice, particularly writing this map state to props function. It's going to be a little bit of a little head swizzle. Go ahead and do that practice. Start using this. We've actually gotten through a bunch of the things that we had that were gross. We got rid of our gross subscription, so that was great. We don't have to set it up anymore. Interestingly, our components no longer re-render on every single action. They only re-render when their dependencies change. So that's actually really, really neat. We're also much more expressive than we were before. Someone can come in and look at this header, and they know exactly what piece of the state this header depends on. They don't need to look anywhere else. They know, oh, this is the header. This is exactly what it does. I could move it anywhere in the application, and it'll work the same. If we wanted to render 3 headers in our counter, we could import header from header, and then maybe we'll make a little div inside of here, and we'll render a couple of headers. Piece of cake. They're all connected to the store themselves. They express their own dependencies. So we actually don't need to do any other wiring up. We can just drop the components wherever we like. How cool, how cool. We've separated our data concerns from our UI concerns, and this is the big power that Redux gives us. So this is something that you can be pretty excited about. That we just get to move around our components without having to think too much about their data, except when we're designing that component itself. Cool. We've still got some other things that we want to deal with. Typos in our actions. We're actually pretty modular at some points. We know how to connect to the store. But we would like to deal better with lots and lots of actions. Probably also want a nicer way to connect to the dispatch function. I actually saw some people on their boards had, they mentioned something called map dispatch to props. We'll talk about that tomorrow. It's basically similar to the map state to props, but with dispatch. Cool. Thanks, everybody.